Cedo la palabra simplemente a Witney, investigador principal, como os comentaba, del European Council for Foreign Relations y coautor con Anthony Dworkin del informe. Sin más, Nick, cuando quieras.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Olivia, for that introduction, and thank you, of course, especially for making this magnificent facility available to us today for this discussion. Thank you, too, for my fellow panelists here. I sit here a little uncomfortably because I know that all three individuals to my right actually know rather more about this subject than I do. But that's the advantage of having an open debate. My role is simply to put some provocations or suggestions on the table. And what I have to say really falls in, I think, three parts. The first is just the observation that last year was a great year. It was the year of the Arab Spring. It was a year in which, in my view, Europe responded with surprising success to these shocking events which had occurred on the far side of the Mediterranean, for which we were totally unprepared. 2012 is more difficult. It's more difficult, obviously, in North Africa, and at the same time, I think it's clear that the deficiencies of the European response are becoming more clear as time goes by. The second point I want to make is that this matters. It's important. It's important not just because we like democracy. It's also important very much in terms of European interests that we should get our response right and be as supportive as possible to the processes happening on the other side of the Mediterranean. And the third point is that so we should be doing better as Europe, and it's to suggest ways in which we could be doing better. And the essence of the sort of approaches we suggest is that what we need to try to do in our response is to be more political and less technocratic. So to go through those 3 points in a little more detail, 2011, it was a fantastic year, a very exciting start to, we all witnessed the demonstrations in Tahrir Square and felt suitably inspired by what was going on and the overthrow of tyrannies, and a number of us Europeans actually took the risk of military action to assist the process in Libya. And having been taken entirely by surprise by these events, we collectively, I think, can take credit for having got ourselves on the right side of history, of declaring unequivocal support for the Democrats. And I believe that Brussels did a reasonable job in providing a framework for Europe's response by producing this doctrine of more for more, by coming up with the idea of the 3 M's of money, markets and mobility, which would frame the European support. It was logical, it was a good concept, it was something around which the European member states could converge. Well, 2012, much more difficult. The impression of a democratic wave sweeping unstoppably across the Arab world no longer seems so guaranteed. I don't intend to dwell on the inevitable problems that Egypt, Libya, Tunisia are now facing. I think in some ways it's almost more concerning is to look at Algeria and Morocco and to ask ourselves whether there's really any serious reform process going ahead in those countries at all, or whether they are simply now watching and waiting and playing for time. And as for the European response, well, those 3 M's of money, markets and mobility are looking rather hollow, a bit of a desert mirage now. Not surprising in a way. We have a huge economic problem in Europe. I don't need to tell you here in Madrid. I don't need to tell you coming from London. We are simply not going to. Europeans, are whatever the merits, we're not going to be throwing open our borders to imports from North Africa or to migrants from North Africa. And as for money, we're used in Europe to thinking that we can always buy peace in our neighbourhood. But if you look at the increase in the neighbourhood budget that followed the Arab Spring, it worked out at 400 million euros a year, 400 million divided between 16 countries. This is not big money. And even at the macroeconomic level, where you might think that Europe had a big hand to play, it was interesting that President Morsi came to Brussels a few weeks ago and went home with €500 million. And at roughly the same time, he was being offered 3 times as much by the Qataris, 3 times as much by the Turks. Gave him a loan of $200 billion. So we have, it seems there is a certain hollowness to what looked like a well-framed response last year. It matters. It matters. I don't need to labour the point that Europeans do have values which they want to promote, and we're delighted to see the democratic transitions proceeding, however uncertainly, on the far side of the Mediterranean. But it matters in terms of our interests, because, in my view, and we argue in this report, we've been too long in Europe in a sort of defensive crouch when we look at North Africa. We've seen the threats: Islamism, terrorism, migration. And we've been much too close to the opportunities. And the opportunities, I suggest, are of 2 kinds. They're economic. This is a hard case to make at the current time of economic crisis in Europe. But if you look, for example, at how Germany has managed to benefit from the enlargement of the EU to the east, to lock in the economies of many Central, Eastern and European countries within the German economic orbit, to have a lot of their automotive spare parts and subsystems manufactured in Central Europe. This has worked wonderfully well to the benefit of both Germany and those Central and East European countries. And the same sort of model is one which it seems to me, and to, I'm glad to say, to many economic experts, which I am not, to be something which could be hugely mutually beneficial to both sides of the Mediterranean if we can develop that over time. And indeed, I've heard Bernardino Leon in the event that Olivia mentioned in Brussels, referring to this as actually an existential requirement for Europe. I mean, his theory was, and it's a theory, but it's attractive in some ways, that the Americas are managing to integrate themselves north-south, that Asia is actually managing to integrate itself north-south, as between China and the developing countries of Southeast Asia, and that if we want to continue to compete in this globalized world, we will need to find ways to integrate ourselves more closely with North Africa and indeed Africa beyond the Sahara. So there's an economic argument. There is, even more pressingly, I think, a huge strategic argument. The Commission in Brussels tends to view the countries of North Africa as essentially as clients, as supplicants, as people who want to come closer to Europe and who need to be trained to become more like Europeans. But of course they're not the fringes of Europe. They are actually an integral part, a key part of Africa, of the Arab world, of the wider Muslim world. I don't need to say anything about the importance of the Middle East more broadly to Europeans. No region in the world is more important. Oil, energy, sovereign wealth, contracts, all these things are vital to us. But there's beyond that, I think, a fundamental issue about how we in Europe establish the right modus vivendi with the Islamic world. And in this Casa Árabe, I scarcely need to make the point. It's been going on for centuries. It needs to go on. It's gone very badly for the last decade. We've had 2 difficult wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had terrorism worries. And it seemed to me that one of the most tragic aspects of the assassination of the American ambassador in Benghazi was the way it showed in the West a willingness to rush back to that conflict of civilization dialogues. There was a completely disgraceful front cover of Newsweek, I don't know whether any of you saw it, of Muslim rage, and this is an attitude of mind which we simply cannot afford in Europe. I think America could. America has a drawbridge option. They can distance themselves from the Middle East, and indeed, in terms of searching for energy independence, that's exactly what they're doing. We can't, even if we wanted to. Islam is part of us. We are committed to finding a way to manage this interaction between Europe and the Muslim world, and getting North Africa right in terms of assisting those democratic transitions, in terms of establishing good and friendly relations, in terms, yes, of building our influence there. This is a wonderful opportunity. My third theme, so if it's important and we ought to be doing better, how can we do better? And I simply say if our traditional ways of buying the neighbourhood, if through economic means, if those economic tools are blunted, then clearly we must reach for other tools. We must use political tools, less technocratic approaches. We must get more strategic in how we deal with the countries of North Africa. And I'll mention some specifics in a moment, but first, what do I mean by getting more strategic? Well, the first thing I think is to recognize these countries as independent actors, to stop treating them as clients with nowhere else to go. They have other places to go. Very strikingly, President Morsi went to Beijing before he ever came to Brussels. That's really remarkable when you consider the Chinese position on Syria. He went to Beijing. He's a pragmatist. They have other places to go. We need, therefore, to treat them as grown-ups, not as European children, but as grown-ups, and treat them with respect as adults. We need somehow to be more strategic. We need to get our own European act together better. Many of the problems of the last decade have been the fact that we've operated our European policies in parallel universes. There's been the universe of Brussels, where we've talked democracy and human rights, and that's been our better side, if you like. And we haven't liked to talk about interests in Brussels. And then on the other hand, there's been the policies which have been pursued in national capitals, particularly, of course, the southern Mediterranean capitals, where most of the national interests are, which have been much more, shall I say, pragmatic, much more concerned with getting the next contract, much more concerned with establishing good relations with whoever is in power at the time. And this bifurcation of values in Brussels, interests in capitals, has meant that we have simply run two policies which have been mutually undermining. They have made us look like hypocrites. They have ensured that we have not been able to bring the full weight of Europe to bear on North Africa. So part of what needs to be done, I think, is to get the rest of Europe more interested in North Africa, and that indeed is happening. The Nordics have shown a whole new interest in North Africa as a result of the Arab Spring. I was in Berlin last week, and it was rather amused. They were a bit cross with me. They said, this report says that France, Italy, and Spain are the countries that count. Well, we Germans think we can and should and will count for more in North Africa. And I said, no, you've misunderstood me. I'm not for a moment saying that Germany should, I think it's great if Germans take more time and trouble to understand North Africa and contribute to policy on North Africa. I don't apologize for the point that Italy, France, and Spain have the interests there, and that you cannot ignore the fact that you can't sit in Germany and say, oh, welcome to Moroccan oranges, or, maybe we should, but we have to accept that different Europeans have different stakes in North Africa. The point, I think, is not to ignore this thing, but the point is to discuss it in Brussels and come up with the right balance, which then leads me on to the point I want to make about being strategic. It means being very country-specific. It means understanding that you can't just, one size does not fit all. More for more is a wonderful slogan. It's not a policy. You have to know how to apply that in each country to the extent you can.